first thing to say, of course, is thanks to Rachel for this challenging and really interesting invitation to do this. I mean, in some ways it's been very interesting to move from the idea that I might be giving a paper to the idea that I might be working with Simon to shape and form an event, which is another kind of labour, it's a different form of labour, and one that in some ways I guess I'm very used to. I do lots of these kinds of events, but in some ways it's completely unknown. And I guess part of the real unknown of this kind of event is what really happens around interdisciplinarity. So I think probably what will happen is what often happens, which is we have a fantastic, hopeful engagement first with the idea of interdisciplinarity, and then we fall into a sort of long period of despair as we realise that, it's kind of impossible. How do we talk across these different kinds of traditions? We don't read each other's literatures. We basically don't know what each other are talking about. And then sometimes after that, there is another kind of phase that kicks in, which is that we realise that we can just lower our expectations, kind of think more realistically about life generally, and find our way towards some kind of dialogue. So if the day has a shape like that, I'd be very happy by the end of it. I want to say something. So thanks, first of all, to Rachel, and second of all, to Julie Farley for all the organisation she's done, to Esther, who I think is just submitting her PhD today, and will be here this afternoon, and then to Luca and Masturia, who are two PhD students and research assistant formerly in the Department of Psychosocial Studies, who've been leading really on the PhD-led day tomorrow, which Simon's going to do a lot of work on, and some of us, of course, will be there. So I just also want to name Paula Fortune, who's the departmental administrator, who's done a lot of the actual work of making packs and ordering catering and all those kinds of things, so to thank her in her absence. I also want to say something about location. So I'm a reader in psychosocial studies, and I'm head of the Department of Psychosocial Studies here in Birkbeck. So welcome to Birkbeck, and also in some ways welcome to the department, which is co-hosting this event with Sussex. We've put a bit of money in and have done some of the organisation. But other kinds of locations, I guess, for myself would include a variety of practices that I usually name as part of what I do when I say who I am. And those practices really begin with a long practice of theatre making with Simon and actually with Joe Kelleher in a theatre company that lasted for about a decade through the 1990s, in which we tried to work out on a kind of daily basis how to make something together. And that was very much done in a context, I suppose, also of the work of other performance and groups and artists. And Terry's here from Forced Entertainment, which is a very, very long-standing and well-established experimental theatre group in the sort of UK scene that's been going now 30.
You could be 30 next year.
30 years next year, okay. So we have longitudinality with us in many ways in terms of the kind of survival of certain kinds of artistic practices in the UK that have been incredibly difficult to allow to survive. The survival of certain kinds of relationality, I guess. I do need to name that Simon is somebody that I've lived with for 22 years. So there's another longitudinal qualitative research project ongoing in a very real and dynamic way. Or maybe just it limps along in the ways that qualitative longitudinal research projects do. And I think that's one set of practices around theatre for myself, and then also I've been obviously involved in psychotherapeutic practice of one kind and another for about 17 or 18 years now. And then the other practice I usually name in terms of myself is the practice of motherhood. So a lot of my work is around the maternal, but it's really around these elongated temporal processes that are involved in care for others. What happens when we think about time in relation to care? And then I guess academia has its own kind of temporal and qualitative set of practices that I'm involved in. So that's just to locate myself a bit. And I guess no one's going to formally introduce you during the day, so I can do that a little bit now. So Simon is at Roehampton in the Department of Performance Studies with Joe Kelleher, where they've been working for a long period of time on ideas about performance and philosophy, ideas about creative practice. He runs an MA in creative practice there. But it's also been involved in other kinds of philosophical processes, including Socratic dialogue and work on philosophy with children and ideas about practical philosophy, how philosophy might be used in everyday practice. And then also quite a long engagement with the Camp for Climate Change, which I suppose in some ways is about engaging with ideas about how we might elongate the future in relation to a set of collective practices in the present. So I just want to name those as our collective practices that are to do with longitudinality that we're bringing to the day. All right, so I'm just going to try to outline what I think might be some of the areas that today might touch on. I'm going to do this very informally. I haven't thought this through in any great detail. And then Simon's going to say something a bit more formal about social art practice, and then we'll introduce our first panel. So clearly from what Rachel's indicated, one of the things that we're thinking about today is to do with observation and practices of observation. So I guess the key question that must be around for many of you who are social scientists is, what does it mean when we observe something or someone from that position of being in a situation or a scene, that we're deeply embedded in the scene that we're also in some ways trying to observe or get a handle on. And those questions then are about what kind of faculties we use for that observation and how do we train them. And I guess what happens to them over time when we're also observing situations that themselves are changing over time. And I guess there would be a question there, which is isn't that what we call living? So is there also a way in which we need to sort of think about those practices as practices of living, that is, of being with or staying alongside others? And what is the paraphernalia then of these different kind of practice traditions, and do we need that paraphernalia would be a kind of question. These are questions that are everyday questions, I think, for ethnographers, for participant observers, for those trained in those kinds of qualitative traditions. But I think what we're going to hear today is about different kinds of observational practices, some of which are drawn from this very interesting tradition of infant observation, started perhaps with Esther Bick in the late 1940s, and has really developed, it has its own international journal. And the key, as I understand it, I'm not at all an expert, and we're going to hear more about it, but the key to those observational practices is that there are modes of encounter, that is, somebody who's watching a mother and infant over time, and then there are modes of reflection, which happen in a group setting, in which those observations are thought about and contextualised in relation to, what can we call it? You might want to call it psychic events, or you might want to call it emotional events or emotional life. So in other words, there's a tracking in the observing process, not just of what you're seeing, but of also what you might try to locate as happening within you, and that's facilitated by a group that helps to do that. So we're already in a kind of nexus of ideas about observation having something to do with sociality, yeah, it's a group process, and something to do with what we might call a psychic event that might be different from an observed event. All right? So I think that that's one of the things that we might be thinking about today in relation to infant observation, and where there might be a crossover or something that can be learnt between that tradition and that of ethnography. And lots of people also talk more broadly about psychoanalysis as a kind of laboratory, a place where certain kind of psychic processes can be observed and tracked over time. And of course, although we think of that as a dyad, it's also a relational process. It often involves a supervisor or someone else that one goes to talk to outside of that dyad. It involves institutions. As we heard very much, I'll introduce you to Belinda in a while, but she's been talking with us about psychoanalysis in Latin America and tracking what happened to psychoanalysis in relation to, obviously, various political scenes, but also to various institutions. So I would argue that psychoanalytic practice, if we want to think about it as a laboratory, is not a laboratory just simply in terms of a dyad. So I think that takes me on to a second thing after observation that I think today will be about, which is something to do with collectivity and the ways that some of the practices we'll be looking at, particularly the performance practices, take on kind of kinship-like structures, right? Sometimes they look a bit like families, some of the theatre groups we might be looking at, and sometimes they actually are families. So I think Joe's going to help to introduce us a little bit to an Italian family and theatre company that is both things at the same time. So if we take, I suppose, the idea that temporality itself is always socially produced, then what we're also tracking in the day is the ways that that temporality is socially produced in these various kinds of groupings or kinship-like structures, whether that's the observing group that's part of the infant observation, or whether it's the idea of a theatre practice, or a theatre practitioner going into an organisation, which is what Richard Lazell is hopefully going to be talking about in a while when he arrives. And then, okay, so that's two things I think we should be keeping our eye open for, this issue about observation and something to do with collectivity. And I guess a third thing that I would want to draw out is something about the visual field, Because I guess what we're looking at a little bit today is how observation is not something that's simply about a reflexive embodied subject, but is mediated, and is often mediated through different kinds of visual technologies, whether those are literally the technologies of film and photography, and some of our speakers will be talking about the role of film and photography in their work, or whether it's a kind of slightly broader understanding of visual technologies. And so I wanted to put that in there as something that we might want to think about in terms of the place of that kind of visual technology in relation to longitudinality. Okay, so what's the difference between photography and film there, for example, or how do we think about the scene? You know, the scene that the theatre draws our attention to as a visual scene that also unfolds over time. And I suppose the last thing then just to draw attention to is longitudinality itself, or time itself. So I'm imagining for some of you, longitudinal research has something to do with returning to a scene, returning again to a scene, one that you perhaps explored initially and you want to go back to after 20 years, in the case of Tina, for example, her research with mothers. So surely psychoanalysis has something to say about processes of return, of the repetition of return. So that's one sort of aspect that we might want to think about theoretically. But other researchers who are working longitudinally will be interested not in repetition and return, but ideas about elongated time, about duration, about staying, about remaining, about sort of stretched time, which is produced collectively. So those are things that I want to hold on to, these different kinds of ways in which time might be operating in your research. And others, again, will make a distinction between the time of encounter, as I was talking about with observation, and the time of reflection. And others will refuse that distinction, so that encounter itself is a form of reflection, and vice versa. So I think those are issues, again, that these practices of theatre making, of performance, of social art practice, and observation might have something to say about. And others, again, of course, are thinking about understanding time in neoliberal conditions, very broadly sort of put, as time that's become totally work time, totally qualified time, so that leisure time itself is co-opted as a form of working for capital in one way or another. Many people here will be familiar with those ideas. So then that always opens the question, what kind of alternative temporalities might be possible within totally qualified time? And I think there we've got a question about the practice of curiosity. So is there something that you're doing as social science researchers, and something that people working in performance or social art are doing in their practice as research, and those who are involved in psychoanalytic practice? Is there a kind of practice of curiosity that might provide a mode of opening, or you could even say respite, from what we might think of as otherwise totally qualified time, or time that's been completely co-opted by work time? So I just wanted to put in that kind of extra quasi-political aspect to the day. So that's it, really. Those, for me, are the kinds of questions that drove the way that we put today together. Just to reiterate what Rachel said, we don't actually know at all how the day's going to go. So we'll have to see. I already want to make a small change to the programme, which is, I looked at the programme last night and suddenly went, oh God, there's an hour and a half of kind of blank time, you know. What was I thinking we were going to do in that? Which is the time after lunch, which is something like exploring questions, or like we're going to do something together. What I'd actually suggest we do is move the panel that's after tea straight after lunch, so we're done with, if you like, presentations, and that we have an elongated time that we think together about the kinds of questions that are being raised. We'll have to generate the questions, because my questions won't be your questions, and your questions will change over the day. So I think I might just get some materials, whatever, flip chart paper or stickies or whatever it is, and that we can decide whether we want to work on tables and pool things, or want to work as a large group. So it's a really open space. And then tomorrow is creative but much more structured. So for those of you who are going to stay tomorrow, Simon's going to be doing some psychogeography work with you and things out if it doesn't rain too much in the world itself. Okay. All right. So I'm going to hand over to you just to do your brief introduction, and then I'll do the program.
Okay, great. I think we're already running late, so it's in the spirit of it. While I was very grateful when Rachel extended the invitation to do this, and Lisa sort of had to twist my arm, I've got to say I was a bit anxious about it, because I felt like I was really stepping out of my zone, my comfort zone. And I have to confess that 6 months ago I didn't know what QLR was. Yeah,
That's very healthy.
I've done my homework. I've read about it, and I can see that I do know what it is at some level, almost intuitively. And I found lots of great correlations between the kinds of things that I've been working on and working with. But I think one of the sort of challenges of transdisciplinarity or interdisciplinarity is basically come up against the limits of what you don't know, and then to go into a field, a sort of shared field of exploration, and in a kind of naive and somewhat innocent way. So I come to you in that kind of way, sort of unprepared in a way, and as a result, I've kind of over-prepared. So I've made a sort of formal statement that I want to read out. Because as I was saying, it's like I was, in a way, I was thinking, how do I kind of cross this which feels to me quite a large distance between some of these kinds of practices and my own experience. Coming late to academia, I did my PhD in my 30s, and having spent a lot of time just working, making performance, making theatre, and sort of operating in a kind of expanded field of art, which is a kind of very rich and diverse field, but doesn't really have much connection necessarily with sort of more sociological traditions. But fortunately this morning I was hearing on the radio, there was an interview with someone who was doing some work in the Art Institute in Detroit, and the journalist was describing going into the institute, and there was a beautiful mural on the wall there by Diego Rivera, and the inscription above the mural is, "Life is short, art is long." I thought, yes, that's it. I've been saved. There's a longitudinal element to art, of course. We just never use that word. Qualitative, longitudinal are just words that we don't use in art practice. Research has just sort of happened in the last maybe 20 years in terms of actual research being something that one might do through creative practice. So really what I want to do is, as my sort of over-preparedness, is to kind of tell a story about how, in my field, we've arrived at this thing where what we're doing, or a lot of what we do, the kinds of innovative sort of art forms that have quite a lot of currency in the art world, but also in academia, is now called social practice. Just that. So that's always really interesting to me. Like, how did we arrive at that term in which art, or anything resembling art, has totally disappeared? Yeah, we used to have something called socially engaged art. That was about 1990s, and that evaporated to social practice. So for me, the kind of point of conjunction, maybe between the different sort of disciplines, traditions today, is about this realm of the social, which art has sort of converged on. So my story is really about how we got to this place of social practice in where I'm sort of coming from. So this is how it goes. The 20th century bears witness to a series of ongoing attempts to align art and the investigation and transformation of social life, often fueled by the utopian aim of the complete dissolution of art into life through the refusal of the holy trinity of authorship, spectatorship, and the singular art object or event. What replaces these elements, what replaces the contemplative act of spectatorship of the work of artistic excellence, becomes the extended processes of collaboration and participation, often engaging marginal publics and communities through conversation, negotiation, discussion, or dialogue, towards acts of co-creation beyond the times and spaces of the gallery, the theatre, or the museum. Since the 1970s, art history has generated a constellation of terms around successive waves of this type of practice: happenings, community art, new genre public art, relational art, dialogic art, relational aesthetics, and more. We've got to socially engaged art, and as I was just saying, more simply, social practice. What's most striking about this last term, social practice, is the elimination of the word art, leaving social to stand alone as the only qualifier of practice. The implication here is that for art to properly engage the social, it must abandon art. How should this emergence of an art that dare not speak its name be understood? Rather than being simply another fashionable term, I want to suggest that this paradoxical disavowal of art is perhaps the essential aspect of what might be contemporary about contemporary art, and perhaps even the entire history of what gets called modern art. Like contemporary capitalism, contemporary art must continually seek its own renewal through rejection or reappropriation of what has already been done. The story of modern art's ambiguous relationship to its own history could be simplistically described as a perpetual struggle between the drive for artistic autonomy, for art to do its own thing in its own kind of a way, and an equal and opposite desire for its heteronomy, for it to be basically subject to something other than itself. So taken in its autonomous mode, art could be about freedom, self-expression, the creation of new images, narratives, sounds, experiences that shift perceptual horizons and perspectives, constituting and accessing uncharted territories through acts of representation, curiosity, beauty, the unknown, the inarticulate, the ineffable, the sublime, disposing the spirit to ideas, as Kant had it, unfettered by notions of use, utility, application, or calculable social impact. The purpose of art, from this angle, is its purposelessness, a purpose best served by making special times and places for art that are distinct from those of the rest of life, that be theatre shows, gallery exhibitions, or festivals. Art does only something that only art can do, offer some kind of what we call aesthetic experience. This argument, which dates right back to Schiller in the 18th century, also involves the notion that autonomous art can enlighten the spectator, prepare or educate him or her for political action and social change. But it cannot be the site of those transformations. That is simply to expect too much of art. Okay, so in its heteronomous mode, art is about something completely different. It becomes about relation, about engagement, binding, responsibility, solidarity, collective emancipation. It's about connecting the unconnected, joining what is separated, including the separation of art from everyday life and from the practices of leisure, entertainment, and of the separation of artists from non-artists. Ultimately, its ambition is for an art that might make a singular contribution to the imminent transformation of everyday life, a new way of doing politics when politics as traditionally conceived has failed. In this way of thinking, art has no essence. It's a kind of intangible quality, a factor, a way of doing things, a sensibility that can be brought to bear on any kind of activity. Contemporary art continues to oscillate between the poles of this autonomous, heteronomous dialectic. Art has no purpose and possesses an entirely intrinsic value, yet art is also claimed as the sole experiential mode capable of reversing the deleterious effects of modernity. But whereas once it wagered on the possibility of a revolution in everyday life, it now must operate in a more reparative mode, with the concomitant risk of co-option and appropriation by state or corporate interests, the reality of which has pretty much become an accepted part of the artistic landscape today. So maybe in brief, what appears to have happened is something like the production of an art function or art coefficient, that bit in maths that always is like a sort of superscripted number next to the real numbers, sort of qualifies them. Decided that art has become a kind of coefficient that can be added, supplemented to any other kind of activity. So art no longer persists as a boundaried practice, object, or event. The survival of older forms notwithstanding, paintings are still made, theatre productions still happen, festivals are still produced. But paradoxically, this also produces a certain kind of self-protective defensiveness, in which art that is not art also has to distinguish itself from not art, which is other kinds of practices that it appears to increasingly resemble, like sociology, or anthropology, or social work, or academic research, or qualitative longitudinal research. But it's precisely during the same period that the disciplines of sociology, anthropology, and cultural studies begin to establish themselves. And obviously there is a rich relationship between the artistic movements of the 20th century and the formation of these disciplines. Mass observation was clearly in dialogue with the insights offered by surrealism and psychoanalysis. Harold Garfinkel's breaching experiments look pretty much like street actions of performance art, or the invisible theatre of Augusto Boal in Brazil. Jean Rouche's ethno-fictive films emerged alongside the new wave cinema in the late 1950s and claimed him as one of their own. But the paradox of art's need to cultivate its own integrity and autonomy while simultaneously pursuing its own dissolution into everyday life was perhaps compounded by the politics of academic disciplinarity from the 1970s onwards, in which training in artistic practice, at least in the UK, developed entirely separately from the critical study of arts within the academy. Even studying drama in the late 1980s at Edinburgh University, the idea that students actually might move around in the classroom was such a radical novelty that it had to be carried out without informing senior faculty. Today, that situation has been complicated by the rapid reintegration of the visual and performing arts within the academy, firstly through the absorption or the transformation of formerly autonomous arts and performing training organisations inside academic institutions, and secondly by the relatively recent emergence of practice as research within those environments. While artists have had teaching positions and roles within universities for decades, it's only really in the last 15 years that structures of funding have shifted to recognise that certain types of artistic practice also qualify as legitimate forms of academic research. Just as an example of that, when I was doing my PhD with Joe at Roehampton, I think there were 3 of us, 3 PhD students. We were all basically artists, but we were all writing big, chunky dissertations, theses. Now, in our same department, we've got nearly 40 PhD students, perhaps 70% of which are doing PhDs through practice. Again, they've all come from artistic, creative backgrounds, and the primary element that they're going to be submitting for their work is going to be creative, practical work. So that's a big change in just 10 years. As a result, contemporary forms of art as social practice operate in and between the often conflicting disciplinary demands of academic research, the legacies of autonomous avant-gardism, and the policies of social inclusion and so-called outreach that inform most arts funding within the UK today. So kind of to be an artist today means moving between all these spheres, which in a way explicitly contradict each other about the kind of values that they want to pursue. And part of what it means to be an artist today is about inhabiting those different mindsets, speaking 3 languages simultaneously to different kind of constituencies. So today I've invited a range of people who work in and among these different contexts, and I'm fairly sure that they probably experience these conflicting paradigms and values quite keenly. The academic field with which I have perhaps the most affinity, performance studies, proudly inaugurated itself in the 1980s as a non-discipline, a magpie field that went on to borrow methods from right across the spectrum of academic and artistic practice, often productively, sometimes problematically. Similarly, it's very evident that there is now considerable interest and expertise within social research in working with the methods and media of a wide range of creative practices. A few years ago, Performance Studies International, which is our sort of field into big international conference, normally 600-700 people in some international city. They had a conference called Becoming Uncomfortable, which felt kind of pretty cool. And so I went to the conference, but the conference was actually, as all that conference always is, was very cosy and convivial. Yeah, didn't feel uncomfortable at all. So I think, trying to escape the orbit of one's own kind of centre of gravity is quite difficult. Even if the will is there, you find yourselves kind of sucked back into what's familiar, because that's where you can do a lot of good work quite quickly. But today feels to me something different, so I'm kind of grateful for the kind of proper discomfort that I think, and I'm looking forward to participating uncomfortably in what we do over the next few days. Thank you very much.